Hello there, and welcome to the Allegheny Front Hawk Watch. Today is our first day of counting, and unfortunately we don't have visitors, so we wanted to try something different to keep you informed of what's going on and allow you to still celebrate this hawk watching endeavor. So it's clearly raining. We have a nice east wind, but it's kind of miserable out here right now. You're behind the car, so you're not getting wet. But I was in the car and I was reading this latest paper about satellite tracking in broadwing hawks. And so I figure, since not everyone reads these kind of journal papers, that maybe I could keep you informed about them. And this one's a really interesting one by Rebecca McCabe. We all know Lori Goodrich, Dr. Goodrich at Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, David Barber, Terry Masters, Jesse Watson, Aaron Bain, Autumn Lynn Harrison, Peter Mara, and Keith Bilstein. And so let me just describe to you what is in this paper, since a lot of people don't have access to the Wilson Journal of Ornithology. And today we're talking about Buteo platyparus. I think that's how you'd pronounce the Latin name, Platyparus, something like that. That's our broadwing that is going to be coming down these ridges in about another month or so. And this particular paper tells us an awful lot, things that we couldn't know before. And it's all due to telemetry. And so they've spent the money, and they have 14 broadwings that they are tracking, mainly from right around Kempton, Pennsylvania, at Hawk Mountain Sanctuary. And they've been doing this since 2014, and this has just been published, so they probably ended in 2019. Out of those, we had 3 juveniles and 8 adults. There's also another subset of broadwings from Alberta, Canada. And we're not going to concentrate as much on them, but we'll mention them. And when our broadwings are coming down here, and this paper is going to give us a little bit of insight to that, they're on a 5,000-mile journey, according to this paper. 5,000 miles is about average. And there's a couple interesting things that we could never figure out without this telemetry, is that there are 2 main methods of migrating for these large raptors. And the one that they're talking about is the energy minimization. In other words, if you're a hawk, you want to float on these ridges and the air that is giving you lift. But there's another strategy that broadwings also use, and that's time minimization. And I'll just cut to the chase in case you don't want to listen to the rest of this. What this group is finding is that these particular broadwing hawks seem to be displaying some kind of hybrid model of this, where they will minimize their energy use as they come down the ridges, and then they will end up minimizing their time as they go through Mexico and down into South America. And a lot of people always ask, where do these hawks end up? Well, in this particular case, many of them are ending up in Nicaragua, Brazil, Peru, and Colombia, at least the Pennsylvania birds. And some of the others from Alberta, and I think there was just 3 of those, were Venezuela, Bolivia, and so on. Okay, so let's get right to the study here and tell you a little bit more. First of all, they do a literature search, and they find that in the last decade or so, our broadwing counts, the overall population is down about 5%. And they also, unfortunately, mention that these birds are still subject to human persecution. And what a shame. And that's because they congregate in such large groups, it makes them susceptible. Each one of these telemetry devices cost roughly about $3,000. And so when you add all of these birds together, this is quite a study. They're going to be spending a substantial amount of money, and they're going to unfortunately lose a few of these. Not all of the birds that they are putting these harnesses on are going to make it back year after year. Several of them have. and they document this inside this particular study. First thing they have to do is they have to capture a few of these broadwing hawks. They might use mist nets, or they might climb up the tree and grab juvenile. Once they have these birds, they have to fit them. And they also have to make sure that they fall within the 3% rule. In other words, if you're carrying a load, you don't want to add any more than 3% to the mass of the bird. And the mass of the bird, I think, on average was 380 grams, and the transmitters were a little under 10 grams. And so for that reason, most of these broadwings that were selected are going to end up being female. There are limitations to these telemetry devices. They have solar cells on the back, and they are going to need charged, but when our broadwings go at night into the trees to roost, they're not going to be charged. During the day, many of these are going to end up having stopovers. If you're stopping over and you're under a canopy, you're not going to be charging your unit. The solar cell isn't going to get the photoelectric effect that's going to power these transmitters. So they had to make a few decisions, and one of the methods that allows you to have a pretty nice idea of what's happening with these broadwings, for 3 of the birds, these are the older telemetry devices, they were leaving them on for 8 hours. So they would track the birds for 8 hours, and then they would shut them off for 48 hours. Now, you would obviously not know where they were in that 48 hours, but at least you had a glimpse. Day after day after day, you would be able to track them. And the last 8 were, or 11 birds, they were on 5 hours during the day, and then 24, I think they would then shut off for the rest of the 24 hours. And that would give you a pretty nice indication of what's happening with the bird, especially the 24-hour. If a bird has stopped over, and every bird in this study did at least stop over once. Many of the birds stopped over for a couple days. The median duration of stopover is 2.5 days for all birds. And the most interesting thing about this is not all the stopovers were caused by precipitation. If it was raining, yes, most of the birds are going to stop over. But many of them were using that time to hunt and to refuel. Dates of departure is another interesting thing. What this study is also showing us is that before the birds migrate, like many other passerines and other birds, they get a little bit wound up before they leave. And the literature that they're citing, and what they're essentially saying in this paper, is they think that the birds tend to disperse a little bit from the breeding area before they take that migration. So most of these broadwings in Pennsylvania tended to migrate a little bit either west or north before they ended up migrating south. And the idea is get away from the breeding area, try to find some more food, fuel up as much as possible, and then they would tend to leave. And dates for departure for the nesting territory range between the 12th of July and 16th of August. And time spent in pre-migratory areas varied from 7 to 60 days prior to migration. Interesting again that they're fueling up. And again, what this study is going to conclude is on the way down through these Appalachian Mountains, we're going to end up having these birds that are taking their time. They are really trying to conserve their energy on the way down, so they might stop over, they might feed and refuel. But when they get to Mexico, they tend to minimize time, and that makes a lot of sense. And this also talks about when they're coming back up. And these two strategies you can think of as going to, I'm not a sports guy, but think of going to a sporting event. If you know it's a big game and lots of people are going to be there, you might want to minimize your time and try to get there as early as possible, such as a breeding ground, to get the best spot. But if it's an event that isn't quite as large or important, you might take your time. So once the birds seem to get to Mexico, they really take advantage of the thermals and the wind currents there, and they're going to minimize their time as they work their way down around Mexico and into South America. The rates of flying indicated in this particular study, the slowest was 46 miles per day, and the fastest was 150 miles per day. So these birds can cover quite a bit of distance. And both adults and juveniles are essentially following the same paths, so there didn't seem to be a large difference. And let me just, my papers are getting wet here. I don't know if you can tell, but I'm speckled from the rain. And this is going to be very hard to see, especially when they're wet. But you can see that most of our broadwings in this study, they are following a pretty narrow path. That's going to be very hard for you to see. Maybe I can put a picture up later. But they do follow this narrow little band. And then once they get to South America, they do spread out quite a bit. 13 of the 14 broadwings in fall did have stopovers, and many of those were in Pennsylvania. And they might stop over for 3.5 days or so on. Probably earlier in the migration because they're not down south at this point. But, you know, a lot of hawk watchers don't read these studies. It turns out they're really interesting. Some of the technical terms are a little intimidating, but they're really not that bad. And one of the interesting things that this paper seemed to suggest is the birds from the west, when they all converge as they're going down past Veracruz, is the western birds tend to be a little bit later than the birds coming down the ridges here. So they get pretty much 2 waves down there, and if you're at the Allegheny front, we're part of that first wave. And I think we can, they simply conclude that through their telemetry, through their pinging of their data, they're able to say that most of these broadwing hawks are following something like a hybrid model of the two, the time minimization versus the energy minimization, and that's an important finding. One of the limitations of this study is the technology, and we say it's a limitation, but really, I mean, it's just incredible that we have these telemetry devices. Before, when you would band a bird, and it was like a needle in a haystack ever getting information on that bird again. But you always like to tell the limitations of a study. Imagine if we could leave these transmitters on all the time and know exactly what's happening, if birds are being harassed at night, all these interesting things that you could find out. Either way, really accessible study. I thought it was fantastic read. So if you get a chance, again, this is Satellite Tracking Reveals Age and Origin Difference in Migration Ecology of 2 Populations of Broadwing Hawks. And this is in the Wilson Journal of Ornithology. And it just came out. Thank you very much, Lori Goodrich, for sending this to me. All right, I hope you enjoyed this, and if we get some birds, we'll let you know.